Hey folks, Steve here with a special Nations in Arms video for you today. This video, we will be covering the scenario 1812 Spires of the Kremlin, which is the scenario that covers the French invasion or the Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Now, the reason why we're doing this is in my previous sort of grand campaign playthrough, I kind of screwed up as the Russians, to be quite honest. I didn't do very well. I don't think I used them as effectively as I could have, which maybe would have meant that French uh, French actions in Russia were not to be as successful, and then we would see a more contested rest of that campaign, maybe even a French loss rather than a victory. So this video is to make up for that and to make sure we can explore the system to a pretty good degree. I get the sense that this scenario, much like the Spanish ulcer scenario, might serve as good practice for a grand campaign. So if you were, I don't know, you made an arrangement with your buddies, you're going to play Nations in Arms, and you're going to play Russia, you might want to play this scenario a little bit, maybe repeatedly, and get some practice. Just like if you were going to play Spain or a coalition, or the coalition, maybe you practice the Spanish ulcer scenario to get really good with the guerrillas. Now, the Russians have a special unit themselves, which are the Cossack cavalry units. We did use them in the campaign, but they were really like Death Star trench running, trying to disrupt French supply lines long after the Russian armies had already met decisive defeat. So we're hoping to use them a little bit differently. I think very generally the Russians will be wanting to avoid combat as much as possible, draw the French into the plains of Russia, and then maneuver such to cut those supply lines. What mistake I made in the Grand Campaign is that I had the Russian armies defend a little too close to the border. The French armies and their allies managed to achieve pretty decent victories. And it was just all downhill from there for Russia, despite some heroic efforts to stop them from being conquered. So here, this gives us a chance for a Russian redemption, and we'll play this through. This will probably be a single video. The other thing to know is that this scenario is only 3 turns long, 3 seasons. So it's summer 1812, autumn 1812, and then winter 1812. There is no production, though there are some timed arrivals as reinforcements that will come in, as well as replenishments throughout the couple of turns here. So again, no production, but there are reinforcements. They will trickle in, mostly I'd say to the advantage of the Russians, obviously. So even if the French are achieving great victories, there will be a smattering of some Russian troops that are going to show up, assuming that the reinforcement locations that they would come in are not occupied by the enemy. So tall order for the French here to achieve a different sort of victory. And I can understand how interesting this whole scenario is, because this was definitely where Napoleon failed, and failed as his army fell apart in the winter attrition. Now, the start things off, just to note, there are cards. We're not going to draw any new cards, but both players start with some cards. The French player has the forced march card, which means they'll get a little bit of extra activation, probably for Napoleon himself. And then the Russians have a number of cards. They have Holy Russia. So if they're invaded, which they will be, they can set up during the round following invasion 2 militia corps, 1 infantry corps, 3 leaders with 2 stars, blah, 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 blah. There might not be a whole lot of Russian force pool left to actually use this card, so we might wait to use it, actually. We also have the Scorched Earth card, which will cause devastating attrition at some point, whether that's in autumn or not, I'm not sure. And then also the Winter Campaign card, which will mean that attrition gets rough, and but you can still fight in Russia. So These cards are going to come in handy. They are going to be important to the Russian hopes for victory. Basically, Holy Russia will allow us to get even more reinforcements on the board. The winter, or rather the scorched earth, will hopefully hit the French forces pretty hard with attrition. And then even the winter campaign card, if we choose to use it, which we don't have to if we don't want to, that winter campaign card could make what might be looking like a bad situation for the French even worse, as the Russians could choose to keep things going, keep fighting, and cause even more attrition with that additional modifier. So the Russians certainly have a lot of advantages here. They have units all over the place in Russia, as is expected. They have a good set of cards to use. They have more replenishments, which puts them in a pretty good situation overall. And even their leaders aren't too bad. Kutuzov is one of those reinforcements. So if you look around and notice that there's no Kutuzov, he is showing up later. But even the leaders they have on the board right now aren't terrible in terms of the Russian leaders. So we'll see how it goes. There's a number of special rules that are in play for this one. They're kind of restrictions, like certain leaders aren't available. If a leader dies or is wounded and you want a replacement leader, you have to draw from the single star pool of leaders before you draw from the 2-star pool of leaders, which is kind of interesting. You can't simply get rid of a leader unless they lose a battle, and even then there's limitations on leader dismissal. So however good the leaders are or are not, it's a little bit harder to get rid of them. There's also a special rule for Jerome making one of the the French army of Germany worse for activation, which is amusing. Um, and then should also know that the French have called out conscripts, and so none of their +2 infantry are actually +2; they're just +1. Besides that, the other thing we should talk about quickly is the victory conditions. So maybe not too surprising, the French player wins if it owns or occupies Warsaw, which they start with, Vilna across the border, Riga, and either St. Petersburg or Moscow. So I have marked those locations with red bingo chits. Some of them are underneath units, so they're maybe a little hard to see, but I have marked them just to make sure we know, yes, indeed, that is an important location for victory conditions. And what's interesting is that the Empire wins it. You need that set, and it's either St. Petersburg or Moscow, not both. It's either. So we could just ignore Moscow, and I'm wondering if maybe we should just do that, because I'm not entirely sure that I don't know. I don't care. I want to win, so maybe I don't even go for Moscow. And I guess there's a question. I'd have to go look it up. What were the French attempts to reach St. Petersburg in this campaign? I'm not sure of that off the top of my head. Russian wins if at the end of play the Empire has not met its victory conditions, and the following 5 cities are free of in-supply Empire units. That's Moscow, St. Petersburg, Smolensk, Kiev, and Riga. So, some of those cities are kind of off the beaten track, and I don't even know if we're going to be bothering to be messing around in Kiev. So it feels like most of the action is going to be in the northern theater, to be honest, and it certainly feels like it may be easier to get to St. Petersburg than Moscow, and that might be where I want to focus my efforts, to be honest. We start with Warsaw, which is just at the edge of the camera view there. And we would need to cross into Russia, take Vilna, keep an effort up to get to Riga, and then run out to St. Petersburg. That feels a lot easier than some of these other things, because trying to get out to Moscow seems very dangerous. I'm a little worried these victory conditions are skewed. I kind of feel like you should have to go to Moscow, but we'll see how it plays out. I mean, it either way should be an interesting progression. So yeah, and the other special rule is the French go first, but they have to use their land 4 chit, which means that really only Ney and Napoleon will activate, and they're just right over here. Only they will be able to activate to start with on this first activation. They'll probably aim to take Kovno, maybe, rush ahead to Riga, but we know that the Russians are going to go next, so you kind of have to think through like what makes the most sense here uh, with that first activation, knowing that you're only going to be able to do so many things. Do you break off some corps from the Grand Armée and have them start rushing north? You could do that. There are some leaders like Davout who could activate separately. So we definitely have some options here, and we're not necessarily having to just activate those two armies. We can technically do a little bit different types of things here to make a move. But the Russian armies are here, here, and here with some supporting corps stacks around those areas. So again, I need to remind myself: don't stand and fight. Almost in every case here, it is going to be better to evade away, avoid combat. If there's if we fail to avoid, then we're just going to have to eat shit there. But if they avoid combat and get into a nice position where they can be reacting to French moves and cutting supply lines out in the field, much better idea than getting walloped by the die roll modifiers of Davout or Napoleon or anything else going on there. I think that's what's going to make sense. So anyway, guys, let's get this started. I'm going to play a couple chits at a time and kind of show how things are evolving. But we're going to aim to get all this done in one video. So I'll get this underway. We'll get started with the first activation, show the aftermath of that. Okay, here we are after the French land 4 chit and the coalition land 3 chit. The French had taken Kovno, but they do have some Russians sitting on top of it now, causing some supply issues that are mitigated to a degree. But they also did take Vilna, so I'm going to have a hard time keeping everything together here with the stack. It's kind of hard to see with these activation markers, but starting to push out. We even are right now sitting on top of Riga, but we still have to siege it with Davout. The Russian armies are kind of retreating across the river line. And I just knocked over some stuff. Goodness, guys. I just can't do anything today. Anyway, knocked over my cup full of chips. But the Russians are pulling back, basically, and have largely been able to retreat away. But we'll see. There was a couple of corps that couldn't get away from repeated French attacks, and that is what really cleared the way to get up to Riga there before the Russian stack came to try to cut off some supply. That stack is not an army, which is why they're doing that, just to be disruptive. But I want to make sure the Russian armies are retreating back into that open field area to cause some havoc. We'll say the Russian-Polish army did come down through here. They dropped a depot, and the Austrians, I guess, made a mistake in retreating, not feeling like they would win the combat if it was sustained. They retreated out, and in the process, the Russians took the fortress of Lemberg here and then decided to not reactivate it. And it occurred to me, only after I took the fort, to leave it destroyed, as that's more advantageous to the Russians. And I guess had thought, if I had thought that through, I might not have retreated as the Austrians, but the Austrians retreated back a hex. Again, Russians took the fort and then pulled away. And the problem is because there's no production in this scenario, that's going to force the Austrians to leave behind a detachment to be in supply if the Austrians were to push further north. So the far right flank of the Imperial forces entering Russia are basically already starting from a bad spot because now they don't have that fortress. It was not reactivated. The Russians can continue to be in supply. They can retreat back to Kiev and then pull out around. And it's going to take a lot more investment of resources on the Imperial side to make any gains down here in the southern area. We've not yet taken Brest-Litovsk as the French. And there was a moment where we thought about coming to attack Warsaw, but again, it's like that's a trap. If we had done that, the French could simply seal off their supply and eliminate them. So instead, we are gonna try to be elastic. We're gonna pull back. The key thing is to try to keep the French out of St. Petersburg, which is why the First Army is pulling up to here, where they'll do what they can to cut off supply. And the French know that they can't head north even to Narva without dealing with the Russian army at this point because they could get cut out of supply very easily if they try to go to Narva without neutralizing the Russian army. So the situation is interesting to see what can we do, and understanding that there's only so many activations a turn, right? So you figure there's really a certain amount of movement points that the French are going to have, period, to take fortresses, get supply, do what they need to do, and still achieve victory. And I think the general Russian strategy, and this kind of syncs up with the sort of scorched earth idea, is if the Russians can get behind the French and retake a fortress, they might not even choose to reactivate it. They may simply let it be destroyed, and then that's going to force the French to break off detachments instead of retaking a fortress, which they could conceivably do. The Russians come in behind them and just destroy the fortresses, which will make supply even harder. The Russians might have their own problems maintaining supply, but they can kind of deal with that maybe a little bit better, all things considered, and just make this a really tough time. So anyway, I'm going to get to playing some more chits, and we'll show the aftermath of that. Okay, here we are at the end of the summer turn. And I'd say the Russians have done a pretty good job of keeping their armies intact. They've lost a few steps here and there, but have largely been able to kind of create a new defense line. Unfortunately, just due to the way that most forces lack ZOCs or ZOI, zones of influence, if they're not armies, the French have been able to make some moves to secure supply, get depots laid down, and actually have taken Narva. Napoleon used the forced march card to move even further beyond, and is now just a few hexes away from St. Petersburg. Now, he's got to do a lot of fighting to kind of break through and siege it down. And all the while, he would be seeking to maintain a supply line while there are still potent Russian forces out here. But the French line ends at Vitebsk, which is currently besieged. The French don't actually own Vitebsk yet, but there are a number of Russians nearby that could make that a hard get. Now, there are reinforcements coming into Moscow with Kutuzov. So it still kind of remains to be seen how things are going to go. We did have Davout's enlarged corps actually destroyed outright by the Russian First Army. So Davout, who's one of the best leaders in the game, is out of it, and he lost a couple corps with him. So that was kind of a bad thing for the French advance. It's pretty tricky, right? You one, have to make sure you can trace supply. Then you need blocking forces that can reasonably expect to at least try to intercept any Russians who could get in their way, or have enough strength to drop a detachment or something to maintain the supply line. So for the summer, the summer actions, and because of that forced march card being helpful, I mean, the French are actually doing pretty good, but it's going to be tough to say how it's going to shake out. I think the Russian Second Army can actually reinforce the First Russian Army, and be in a state such that they can wear Napoleon out and maybe cut off his own supply depending on who goes first in the fall turn, and then obviously the speed of the turns ending due to winter quarters being drawn, I think will also be a pretty big factor. Russia is still sitting on the Holy Russia card, mostly because I didn't have very many units to make use of the reinforcements because they're all on the board. They may play that here. Um, and then Scorched Earth, we're trying to figure out, do we play Scorched Earth now or um, or wait until winter where the attrition will be even worse. But by then, the French might be winning the game. So it's kind of tough to say. We can play Scorched Earth at any time. This autumn turn might just be the one. Um, but again, the French are doing reasonably well to at least have something going. Now the Russians could also make a gambit and run down here and start to cut off the supply, and that might actually be one of the better things that they can do. Um, even if I guess what could have me go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then 7, 8, 9. Probably run out of movement before that. We could try to get into place where we're blocking the supply path for Riga, and that might be the key to siphoning off the French and then hitting them with scorched earth and just watch a lot of French units bleed away. So it's interesting. The puzzle of how this is going to shake out is interesting. In the south here, the Polish army, or the army of Poland on the Russian side, has kind of been in this dance with this Austrian force and now the Poles, where the imperial forces are actually starting to push the Russians back a little bit, but the Russians are basically doing well to keep Kiev out of the hands of the French. And at this point, that force could actually probably just start to run away, run behind Kiev or run to Kiev, because those French forces simply aren't going to have enough movement to be in any way, real way, relevant. If anything, the Russians want to draw the Austrians and the Polish back, or at least maybe keep them from coming up here and providing support. So maybe it is better that he stays down there. He's tying up forces. That's the important thing. And the Russians are still going to get some more reinforcements. We have the Holy Russia card for more reinforcements if guys die off. Not that it's a huge amount, but it is something. It could come in handy in St. Petersburg or in Moscow if it's under threat. What I think is really interesting and is maybe a balancing issue for this scenario is that you need to get you know you need to get some of these cities, Minsk, or I'm sorry, not Minsk, Vilna, Riga. They're all important, and it makes sense that they're important, right? Warsaw is important, Vilna is important, Riga is reasonably important, but for some reason, you can win with St. Petersburg and not Moscow, and in fact, you don't even really need to go for Smolensk if you don't want to. And the historical narrative, like I had to go do some reading, and I even reviewed my copy of Highway to the Kremlin 2 from OSG to kind of understand, like, well, how did this campaign really go? Well, the French, went this way, and they went to Moscow, and like, sure, Riga is a factor, but the fact that we can ignore Moscow and go for St. Petersburg instead, which really they didn't do historically, maybe they should have. That's maybe one consideration. But the fact that it's probably easier to focus on going to St. Petersburg than Moscow seems very odd to me. And I do see it as kind of a flaw in this scenario because I think Moscow is much harder to go for. And if you had to go for Moscow, that's a much greater challenge than just simply sticking to the Baltic coast and running up there to St. Petersburg. That just seems a lot easier in terms of traversing and getting up there and having supply depots and everything else. Where if you're going for Moscow, you're forced to deal with flanks that are very large and potentially susceptible. So I think that's a little weird with this scenario. You should probably consider some house rules that say it has to be Moscow, or maybe like, I don't know, maybe you give some incentive to St. Petersburg, but you have to get somewhere else. Like if you're going to get St. Petersburg, you also have to have Vitebsk and Kiev or something like that. I don't know. Something where it feels a little too easy to focus on the northern path and just go for that, which is not necessarily the historical path that was even pursued for that matter. Moscow was the destination, and I don't know. I mean, the I think the Emperor of Russia did hang out in St. Petersburg during like the capture of Moscow, and that is sort of maybe one thing you say we're going to keep, we're going to try to capture the emperor or something, but like the emperor would be in Moscow instead of St. Petersburg, right? Like it's one or the other. I'm not sure it I don't think it connects well with how we should interpret this situation historically. So I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to play through some of the autumn turn, and we'll see how things develop. Okay, here we are, just a couple chits into the autumn turn. The French were at the doors to St. Petersburg. They, via Napoleon, crushed the Russian First Army and eliminated it, but then had to veer off to remove some threats to their flank. But that did allow, via some backroad movement, for some Russian forces to get on top of the fortresses, although they can't besiege them yet. They're functionally siege level 0. But that had cut a huge amount of these forces off. Those are all French and some Prussians. And then the Russians hit them with scorched earth. Now, the die rolls ended up being pretty good to the French, and they didn't lose that many steps. So it kind of felt a little wasted. Maybe we should have waited for scorched earth till winter. But gosh, we were getting the +4 for those guys being out of supply, and it just didn't have as big an issue. The Russian Second Army did make an attempt to defeat Napoleon and force him back even further out of supply. But unfortunately, despite the -4 to the die roll for the French, their other bonuses made it an even match. And unfortunately, the Russians both lost and became demoralized. And so the Russian First Army is destroyed. The Russian Second Army has a single corps left. The Russian Poland Army of Poland, is down to one corps down here, managed to get back into supply. So it's still kind of unknown what's going to happen here. The Russians are still protecting Moscow in the approaches to Moscow because there is still an army of Germany that could make a trek to Moscow at this point. I think everything's going to come down to now, basically, whether or not the French can reopen their supply lines, which I think they reasonably can, and then Napoleon's got to make a beeline to St. Petersburg and end it. And there's still some activations left to do that with. So it's starting to look maybe like the French are going to pull out a victory maybe here. But gosh, guys, again, I have an issue with St. Petersburg being an option and totally being able to ignore Moscow. I don't know the true design intent there. It doesn't feel quite right, but we'll play it as is and we'll see what happens. Okay, here we are after the end of autumn. The French are in a win condition at the moment. They do control the needed cities, including St. Petersburg. Napoleon sits there happily, and there is a fair number of screening French units keeping the supply path open, blocking the way. Kutuzov has taken a sizable Russian force and is trying to make a knife cut through the French lines to get to Riga to kind of spoil things. There's also some Russian forces kind of preparing to make a gambit down to Vilna. I don't know that they're going to get there in time, but we'll see. We also got some reinforcements that are coming in. I forgot to add these guys, but there is some stacking problems that will be afoot, but we'll take that as we need to. So yeah, I don't know what's going to happen here. The reinforcements that the Russians get will be helpful. We get some more Cossacks. That's going to be really important to make a dive out for cutting supply lines, or at least running in behind the French, and they'll be making a mad scramble to hold open the corridor. Napoleon himself could also kind of swing down and make a difference. That's certainly feasible. The Russians have played their winter campaign card, so attrition will be even worse on top of the usual badness of winter attrition. But the winter campaign also means every chit will be played, so almost everyone's, every stack is going to get to go twice, um, and I think that will be important as we try to run our way through the game. So yeah, so this is going to be wrapping up pretty quickly. Here, one more turn to go. It will be a longer one because of new winter quarters. It could be very decisive. The battles are going to be very important to see what happens here. I do think the Russians could get away with making it a draw. I do not think that they're going to necessarily win. The victory condition for them, uh, let's see, five in supply, Moscow, St. Petersburg. Yeah, at best, Russia is playing for a draw, but you know what? We'll play it through and see what happens. Okay, here we are at the end. The last couple of chits came out, and I could see no way for the Russians to actually get close enough now to one of the victory cities to make a difference, or to even be any way successful in taking one of the cities back. So this is a French victory, but I think this is the first time in this system where I came across a scenario where I really don't feel like the victory conditions fit very well. The fact that we can concentrate on the St. Petersburg path, um, and when, I mean, depending on how you want to look at the historical context, it makes sense, but yet it doesn't make sense. And there really feels like there should be a greater connection between the two. And I'm going to double check the official rules just to see if there's anything that's really different there that maybe I would have missed. Um, Warsaw, Vilna, Riga, and either St. Petersburg or Moscow. Yep, that's the case. That just doesn't quite feel right. And I think if we were playing a version of this where like St. Petersburg's an option, but you need Moscow as well, like that. And in fact, maybe that's really the proper way to do it, right? Like the French got into Moscow historically, and it didn't do them any good. Russia didn't care. You needed St. Petersburg as well. Now we got St. Petersburg, but it would have been kind of hard. Maybe we could have tried it if we tried harder, if we were really going for it. But we also should have gotten Moscow. So I think I think this doesn't feel right. I would suggest that if you play this scenario, you should maybe try to play where you need both Moscow and St. Petersburg, um, because that makes a lot more sense, right? Like the Tsar could hang out in St. Petersburg and ignore Napoleon's letter saying, "Hey, surrender! I want him in Moscow." Go, no, you didn't, and it wouldn't matter. But if the French had both Moscow and St. Petersburg, both capitals, that might have been enough, and that's not what happened historically, right? They focused on Moscow. And maybe you say, I mean, to win, France has to do more and get to Moscow and St. Petersburg. Anything else is a draw. That feels better. Um, Here, I don't know. It didn't feel like it should be this easy. And it should say, like, there were times where it was tougher, but man, when the Russian armies were avoiding and avoiding and avoiding, they eventually ran out of place to really avoid to and not give up St. Petersburg. And they had to fight Napoleon somewhere, and then they did, and we just weren't in as good a position. If I had my armies moving to Moscow, the Russians could have hit them from the left, they could have hit them from the right, they could have done pincer movements. I had a lot more space to work with, but just this corridor north to St. Petersburg, if you can, get on the other side of these rivers and kind of get in a good position, like you can make it work as the French. So this feels like something's lost in translation here, and maybe that should be St. Petersburg and Moscow. I would suggest that if you're going to play this campaign, this scenario, play it as is, see what you think, and then I would probably try it where you need both St. Petersburg and Moscow, and see if that changes things. I think that would probably work a bit better. Or you take St. Petersburg off the table and you just make it Moscow or something. But I feel like needing both capitals makes a lot more sense, and would force different decision making than I can totally ignore Moscow. So chalk this one up, guys, to a weird one. The French won, but I really feel like things maybe would go differently if we had to go for both cities and kind of had to separate our axis of advance a little bit. The fact that I could just focus on St. Petersburg seemed a little too easy, and I'm a little disappointed in the scenario for that reason. I did better as the Russians, avoiding and kind of setting myself up better, but then I also played reasonably well as the French and making sure that my own lines of supply were pretty good, that I had mutually supporting forces. I broke off core to hold areas reasonably well, and the Russians just couldn't necessarily compete with that as much. Maybe I avoided too much. Maybe, if in the Grand Campaign I was too aggressive as the Russians, maybe in this one I was too passive and I should have counterpunched a lot more. It's kind of hard to say. So I think this, there's more to dig at here to play this game and to get good at this particular theater. I think this scenario needs to be modified a bit to truly hit the right chord, but it was an interesting exercise. So we'll call this a video, guys. The 1812 Spires of the Kremlin scenario. The next video I'm going to do, I've decided to go ahead and skip the Napoleon at bay scenario. I feel like we're going to get a very similar feeling scenario by just going straight to the 1815 7th Coalition, the 100 days scenario, which will be the final scenario we play before I wrap this whole thing up and we go to the review. And gosh darn it, I've been playing this game for, I think, 9 or 10 months or something. So I'm about ready to call it good, and put it back in its box and get something else here out on the table. So thanks for watching, guys. Take care. Keep gaming. See you in the next one. See ya.